Howdy there everybody, it's Rain here, and I'm going to be doing what is my version of a deck tech. As you guys know, I'm kind of on cockatrice rather than MTGO, as paying money to test out decks is not really my thing. I do like to support Wizards by going to FNMs, going to events, but online I just want to test things out and not have to worry about my collection online as well as my collection in person. That's just way too much for me. So I'll be doing a deck tech here on the latest deck I will be playing in Standard. It's the deck that made a debut in an SCG Open, I want to say it was last weekend, and it was doing fairly well for itself. It did a lot of work against Constellation, and apparently I didn't see the tokens match, but I heard it was a lot more underwhelming there. So I'm just going to get into this deck. I want to test it as much as I can, because it's a combo deck. It's very hard to know what sorts of hands you're supposed to keep and what sorts of hands you have to mulligan, because typically mulligans are a little more aggressive with combo decks, since you need less tools to win. So there are 3 Singing Bellstrike. This card, I guess I should explain what the deck does first. Okay, so the base combo is you have Temur Sabertooth, and you can read that right now. It bounces creatures back to your hand, most importantly. You have Temur Ascendancy, which is an engine. Actually, it gives creatures you control haste, and that's the really important line, but it also lets you draw cards if you play creatures with power 4 or greater. And Temur Ascendancy turns out to be an engine when you have this Temur Sabertooth out, so you can bounce, and a mana dork that could provide 7 or more mana. So Karametra's Acolyte if you have 7 Devotion to Green out, or Voyaging Satyr with Nykthos if you have 7 Devotion to Green out. Simply because it takes 2 to activate the Nykthos, and 2 to play the Voyaging Satyr, and 2 to bounce the Voyaging Satyr. So if you want a net mana off of the combo there, you're going to need 7 Devotion to Green as well. So both of these are essentially doing the same thing. Voyaging Satyr costs less. It's a little more vulnerable. It doesn't block. More vulnerable to removal. It doesn't really block very well. Karametra's Acolyte does a decent job of doing a Corsair impersonation. It doesn't really kill Rabblemaster, and that's kind of a big deal, but it can block a lot of things without dying. So that's the combo. You can also go off with Singing Bellstrike. So yeah, it's an infinite mana combo. I'll tell you what we do with it in a second. You also can go off with Singing Bellstrike instead of Temur Sabertooth. As I said before, since you need 7 Devotion to Green to make this combo work, if you're able to play a Singing Bellstrike on one of your creatures and use the 6 to untap it and still float an extra mana, you can start adding 7 to your mana pool with Acolyte or Satyr and Nykthos, and using 6 of that to untap it. And this generates infinite mana. Now what do you do with that infinite mana? Well, there are 2 major things you can do with that infinite mana. You can play a Genesis Hydra, which essentially becomes Omniscience Show and Tell, if you guys know what that combo is. Because you can use Genesis Hydra, search up a non-land permanent on your deck, and put it into play, and then you can use the Temur Sabertooth you have out to bounce the Genesis Hydra. Obviously you can't do that with Singing Bellstrike, but if you're comboing a Singing Bellstrike, the first thing you get with your Genesis Hydra is a Temur Sabertooth. So you can then bounce your Genesis Hydra and recast more things, since you have infinite mana. And you can essentially just keep replaying Genesis Hydra, grab every single non-land permanent out of your deck. And to ensure a win, we have Nylea here, who gives your other creatures trample, and gives your creatures all infinite buffs with infinite mana, because you can use this 3 green activation as many times as you want to. The second thing you could do with this infinite mana once you're going off, suppose you don't have a Genesis Hydra, but maybe you have like a second Temur Sabertooth in your hand, or maybe a Pelucanos. You can use this infinite mana to play Pelucanos or play Temur Sabertooth, which will activate Temur Ascendancy, letting you draw a card. And you can use your other Temur Sabertooth to bounce that card back to your hand and keep recasting the creature with power of 4 and keep drawing cards until you hit a Genesis Hydra and are able to go off. Other things to note about this deck: it doesn't have the best anti-aggro plan, but it does have 3 Singing Bell Strike, which, while they're used for the combo, can also double up as a pacifism effect, especially against aggressive decks. There's 4 Coursers, obviously one of the best cards against aggro decks. Life gain, very powerful, and card advantage, and a 2/4 body. It's just great. Karametra's Acolyte, as I kind of mentioned before, it does a decent job of blocking. And Caryatid would be the other thing I point out about this deck against aggressive decks in Game 1. Game 1's very rough though, because we have 4 Temur Ascendancy in the main deck. That may change at some point, depending on how much aggro there is in the format. Temur Ascendancy is mostly, in aggressive matchups, just a pseudo-dead card that may require you to take pain off your Yavimaya Coast to play. So it could be just dead, which is not what you need in an aggressive matchup. And honestly, there are a couple other things, like the Eidolons of Blossom aren't great in the matchup, so that's kind of another thing to consider. Against these slower decks though, this deck is amazing. There's very little extra space, and it's just a well-oiled machine. There's some other cards I could consider later on, but this is the way I'm going to test it right now. It's very resistant to removal. There's 4 Eidolon of Blossoms, as well as the 4 Temur Ascendancies. So if they start removing your creatures, you can simply drown them out in card advantage, especially if it's 1-for-1 removal. Yeah, I think that's it for what I wanted to do for the deck tech. I will be back for gameplay.